Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Book and Author Society event. We are here with Jane Green tonight. And before we get to all the fun stuff, you know I have to talk to you for a few minutes. So for those of you that are new, welcome. We're so glad you found us. Book and Author Society is a literacy organization in the Metro Detroit area. We used to be known for throwing absolutely fabulous luncheons twice a year. And the last 2 years kind of threw that out the window. So now we do these really, really great Zoom events with all of your favorite authors. So for all of you that are new here, we are so glad to see you. And for all of you that are not in the metro area or even in Michigan, so happy you found us. If you are not already, follow us on all of the social medias. We're everywhere except TikTok. We are at Book and Author Society everywhere. And make sure you are following us because we'll have some exciting announcements about our first post-pandemic or still pandemic or post-2020 live event coming your way soon, as well as our next Zoom event in May, which is going to be super exciting. We're doing a panel and I'll talk more about that at the end of the program. And also make sure you're watching the chat throughout the entire program. You're allowed to put questions in the Q&A. We want to be able to ask Jane all of your questions. So make sure you're getting them in the Q&A, and in the chat, you'll find links to our bookshop affiliate. If you buy Jane's book or any books through that, we get a little kickback that allows us to resume giving grants to all of your favorite literacy organizations. And it allows us to continue to host events like this and future in-person events, which, as we know from all of our surveys, you are all super excited about. And that seems to be all of my business at the top. So I would love to introduce Jane. Jane Green is the author of 21 novels. She's incredibly prolific. They include 18 New York Times bestsellers. She has over 10 million books in print. She is published in over 25 languages and has several books in development for film and TV, which I am sure a lot of you will ask about later. Jane is here tonight to talk about her new book, Sister Stardust. Sister Stardust is her first foray into biographical fiction, telling the story of Talita Getty in Marrakesh in the late 60s. So please join me in welcoming Jane Green, and we will assume there is applause just ringing from everywhere because we can't hear it on Zoom.
Hi, Sarah. Lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
We're so excited to have you, and we're so excited to talk about this wonderful book.
Thank you.
It came out last week, I think.
It came out, just under a week ago, last Tuesday. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind. I'm actually speaking to you from my hotel room in Charleston. So I am enormously lucky in that I still get to go on tour. In fact, I get to go on tour again after COVID, a little bit, not huge, but I do have a live event tomorrow. So I'm enjoying the sunshine of South Carolina.
That's so exciting. And as Book and Author Society, we're so excited to hear of other live events coming back and other author tours that give us hope for the future.
Yes. It's funny. I hadn't realized, because like most writers, I am something of an introvert, and yet I hadn't realized how much I need that energy of connecting with readers, and I've really missed it. It's been a hard couple of years.
Yeah, it's not quite the same to do all of these Zoom events and then connect on Twitter and Instagram and all that.
Yeah.
Well, I finished Sister Stardust over the weekend. It's absolutely wonderful. And honestly refreshing in this world with historical fiction that is still obsessed with World War II. And now you get a little bit of the 80s and 90s, which makes me feel quite old.
Yeah.
But to go back to the 60s and have this amazing story, can you talk a little bit about your inspiration?
Yeah, I was born in 1968 in London, and there I grew up knowing of this very famous photographer called Lord Lichfield, Patrick Lichfield, and we just, I don't know, somehow we were always aware of his photographs, and when I was probably a teenager, I saw one of his photographs, which was of a very beautiful woman on a rooftop, almost sort of lounging in a cat-like pose, in an exquisitely embroidered caftan. And behind her was a man in a hooded robe, sort of looking to the side, and there was a mosque in the background. It was clearly Morocco, and there was something so mysterious about this picture. Also, I think the kind of lavishness of this caftan she was wearing and the exoticism, her beauty, and a look in her eye that I couldn't quite name. Once I started doing the research, I began to understand that it was sadness, but I also discovered that they were so stoned during that photo shoot that it was for Vogue in 1970, and Vogue almost didn't run the pictures. But what I found out was that her name was Talita Getty. She was born in Java, which is now Indonesia, which was part of the Dutch East Indies. And when the Japanese invaded, they rounded up all the Dutch on the island and put them into prison camps. So she spent her early years separated from her father in a prison camp. And there was a lot of torture by the guards and very tough conditions. And that was a trauma that she carried with her. Her mother died shortly afterwards. She moved to London. And when she was in her early 20s, she went to a dinner party held by Klaus von Bülow. She was, by the time, an aspiring actress and a socialite, and a great beauty and a free spirit. And Klaus von Bülow had invited Rudolf Nureyev as her dinner partner, but he wasn't able to come at the last minute. And so in his place, Paul Getty Jr. arrived, who was the son of J. Paul Getty, the oil baron, who was the son of the richest man in the world. And by the end of the night, he'd fallen madly in love, and they got married a year later, bought a palace in Marrakesh. And that was about all I knew when I decided to start writing the book.
That's a pretty solid, good inspiration for a start, though. There's a lot there.
Yes, I didn't actually know about the prison camps. That I didn't know. But I knew she was this sort of actress socialite. I knew she was married to this phenomenally wealthy man. And I knew that she had died very young, very tragically. And actually, I was planning on writing a completely different book. I was all set to write a sequel to The Beach House. And then my new editor said, have you ever thought of writing historical fiction? And actually, your intro made me laugh, because the first thing I thought of was World War II books. And
They're
I
so
have a
popular.
lot of friends. They're so popular. And I have a lot of friends who write them beautifully. And I have no interest whatsoever. It's not something I could do. But when he said historical fiction, I thought, well, do the 60s count? Because if they do, there is one story that I would really like to tell. And as soon as I told him what I knew about Talita, he said, yep, if you're passionate about this, go and write it.
So we have your editor to thank.
Yeah, we really do, because I was playing around with the idea, but I had an agent at the time who said, no, this is not right. This is not right for now. But actually, the funny thing is, my editor is quite young, and he's also a writer. His name is John Glynn, and he had a beautiful memoir that came out in 2019 called Out East, which is a summer that he spent house sharing with friends in Montauk, and it was kind of the summer of self-discovery. But what I realized, because publishing is struggling so much right now, that for the last few years, I've had editors try and sort of squeeze me into something that they think is going to sell. So if psychological thrillers are the thing, then Jane, you need to be doing more kind of psychological thriller type stuff. But he just said, and continues to say, I want you to write whatever it is you're passionate about. And that's because he's a writer, and writers do our best work when we're left to tell the stories we need to tell.
Yes, we want you to be able to tell the stories you want to be researching and you're passionate about. You can kind of tell sometimes when people are phoning it in.
Mm-hmm.
And you're clearly passionate about this.
Yeah. I really am. I have always sort of felt like I would have loved to have come of age in the 60s rather than be born in the 60s. There is something about that time. Also growing up in London, what was so fascinating looking back at the history of England and London specifically, we had emerged from World War II and the Blitzkrieg in London, where London was decimated by bombs. My parents grew up playing in bomb sites. I mean, all the kids would. They just, because there was no money to rebuild, and everybody was still living on rations for years afterwards. Everything was depressed. Everything was grey. And then all of a sudden we get to the 60s and a number of things happened at the same time. And one of the things that happened was that England won the World Cup in football. Now, you would say soccer, but it's actually football. But that created a huge sense of national pride for the first time in years. Then we had the advent of the pill. So all of a sudden there was a sexual revolution and free love. And then for the first time ever, we had our own contemporary music, and we had the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And it was a time when a 15-year-old girl could get her hair chopped off at her local hairdresser where she had a Saturday job. And the next thing you know, the hairdresser submits that photo to a modeling agency, and all of a sudden Twiggy is the face of the swinging 60s. And you know, anyone could become famous, and there was this sort of great meritocracy where the class system went out the window, and suddenly you had lords and ladies who were best friends with Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and Marianne Faithfull. And it was a time of tremendous exploration and discovery and freedom, and also with terribly dark things happening as well, of course. And I think there are actually so many parallels from the 60s to now. And I found it so fascinating to go back and research that time.
Even as you were just speaking, that meritocracy and being able to, anyone can become famous, it feels like what we are watching happening in this moment. And I was particularly, as I was reading, I mean, I am in the Metro Detroit area as well as this organization is, but you mentioned Motown in that as something that had come over.
Yes.
To Britain because you didn't have a music scene. And it was something that I had never pieced together before, because when I think of good rock music and all of that, I am thinking of all of those great British bands.
And they all came out of a love of the blues. I mean, you know, the Rolling Stones, who actually ended up having this tremendous influence on my story. And I didn't really know anything about the Rolling Stones, but I discovered that in the 60s they were completely intertwined with Morocco. Morocco was their refuge and retreat because they kept on getting, you know, but there were drug busts all the time, and the Stones kept getting arrested, and every time they had to escape the press, they would go to Morocco, and they had great friends in Tangier. Brian Jones, who was the founder of the Rolling Stones, was working with the men who play the pipes in Jajuka, and Mick Jagger and Marianne Faithfull became very friendly with Talita and Paul Getty. In fact, in the book, and this actually happened, Mick Jagger left the tapes of Wild Horses with the Gettys after he'd recorded it in the studio. He'd gone to stay with them and left them the tapes.
It's absolutely wild.
Yeah.
And it's so cool to think of all of those people that are interconnected.
Yeah. And that was the thing that I completely fell in love with researching this book and writing my first historical fiction. You think you know what the story is going to be, but as you research, it just takes you down all these extraordinary rabbit holes, and you realize that there, oh my God, I mean, I discovered enough stories for probably 5 books, but certainly that there was a love triangle between Brian Jones, the founder of the Stones, his girlfriend Anita Pallenberg, and Keith Richards. And Anita ended up leaving Brian for Keith, and that love triangle definitely inspired a lot of the story behind the story that goes into Sister Stardust.
I did spend some time Googling for a moment, because you do also make up some musicians and all of that to have your own creative license. And I'm like, some of this sounds familiar.
Yes. Well, and actually I did set up a separate Instagram account called Sister Stardust with 2 T's at the end. And I've posted all the pictures of all the characters in the book with some of the snippets from research and the backstory, and so that's on Instagram. So you can, because everybody who's read this has told me they've gone down that rabbit hole. They want to see what everybody looked like. And yes, a handful of them are made up, but the vast majority of people are real.
And you do such a great job. Maybe it's all of your research and all of your work that went into this, really painting these characters, especially their fashion, everything they're wearing, all of those things. They're very tangible in that way. They speak of their era.
Well, I thank you for saying that. I spent almost a year researching, and it was reading, and because there's so little written about Talita Getty, because the circumstances around her death were suspicious, and so I think, as so often happens in wealthy, powerful families, they just sort of lock down. So there's very little written about her. So I had to come at it sideways, and I had to sort of make lists of anyone that I'd come across who might ever have crossed paths with them or been in their circle, and then read everything that they had written. And every now and then I'd stumble across something amazing, and it would just be glorious. It was just like finding manna from heaven. It was wonderful.
That's such dedication, and that's such a common thing. I'm a history person. Most of our board are librarians. A lot of our viewers are librarians too. We love you all. But I work at a history museum, and that's so much of the research that goes into writing or learning about any type of woman, in that background of, oh, who did they interact with? Maybe they'll get mentioned somewhere.
Yeah. Yes. And I just hadn't, the discipline of that and the rigor of that research was something that I hadn't even realized I'd missed. But, I've spent the last 27 years writing stories from my head. And yes, some of them require a little bit of research, but not in the way that writing a book about not only real people, but a time in history that I really wanted to get right. And that was the other thing that just fascinated me. But I knew that I couldn't start writing until I had a really strong sense of how it felt to have been there. And so I'd been to Marrakesh, and I'd fallen, in some ways, because I've been obsessed with Talita Getty my whole adult life. In some ways, I think I went to Marrakesh because of her, but I didn't realize how much I'd fall in love with Marrakesh. And actually, it is otherworldly. It's unlike anywhere I've ever been. And as soon as you walk through into the old walled city, it's just that everything the colors are so bright and rich, and the smells, you've got orange trees everywhere. So you have the scent of orange blossom mixed with the spices in the souk, with the sandalwood logs that they throw onto fire pits, in the square at night, and then the animal heads hanging in the market, and that sort of raw metallic smell of blood, and it all mingles together to create something that just feels unbelievably alive. It feels like life. And I really, once I went to Marrakesh, I started to understand how this world that the Gettys created, and they really did, they created, they bought this dilapidated palace and restored it, and had these decadent, wild parties, which I'm not even sure that I would have been able to feel them anywhere else, but there's something about Marrakesh where I felt it. I felt, the drugs. They had a delicacy. They called their palace, well, their joke name for it was Le Palais des Plaisirs, the Palace of Pleasures, but they referred to it as Sidi Mamoun, which was the area in which it sits. And the delicacy was this ancient Amazigh recipe called majoun, which is a sort of fudge made with chopped figs and dates and pistachios and almonds and cashews, rosewater, cinnamon and cardamom, and kif, which is cannabis. And so they would make this very strong majoun, and it was like a little fudge. And when guests would arrive, they'd be given this majoun. And that was just the beginning. I mean, there were all kinds of drugs going on, but everybody it was a very different time, and people were flying high.
And that does come across. And
Yeah.
reading, you also, of course, I believe you're also a cookbook author, have a bit of an interest in food. Your food comes across beautifully as well.
Thank you. Yeah, what I really wanted to do was capture the 60s. And it's funny, I've noticed that a couple of the younger readers have made comments on, some of the websites on how it promotes drug use and, anorexia, which it doesn't at all. But this was, you have to put something into context, and this was very authentically the 60s, where the look of the day was Twiggy, and everybody wanted to be famous and wanted to have that look in order to be famous. And it's so interesting to look at it from through today's eyes. And actually a lot of what I discovered I thought was too much. I couldn't put it in because I just thought people really won't understand.
And that's a really nice way of looking at it too. There's so much in historical fiction, and I adore historical fiction. I'm never disparaging what anyone is writing, but you see a lot of ahistoric women with modern morals and modern sensibilities, because that's what we want to read. We don't want to read women as second-class citizens and all of that. But your main character, Claire or Cece, you're right. She is experiencing the life of a teenage girl in the 60s, and she wants to be thin, and she wants to look like Twiggy, and she just wants to get out from her boring life.
Yeah. I mean, she grows up in the countryside, and it is at exactly the time when London just bursts into color. And my mum would speak of I think it was every Thursday night there was a show on, which was in America. I think you had the Ed Sullivan Show, where you had all the bands live every week. And in the UK, we had something called Ready, Steady, Go. So all the bands of the day would be on playing live, and it was black and white. But the host was a woman called Kathy McGowan, and whatever she was wearing, which was usually some fabulous little mini dress from Bieber and some like go-go boots, whatever it was that she was wearing, everybody stopped what they were doing around the country. By the way, we only had something like 3 TV channels, but they stopped what they were doing to watch the show. And then on a Saturday, everybody would take the bus to Carnaby Street, and they'd either go and buy the same outfit or buy the cheaper imitations of that outfit. But it was the first time that anybody in Britain had ever shopped for pleasure. They shopping just wasn't a sport. It was you shop because you needed clothes. And suddenly in the 60s, it was all about fashion and style, and London was the center of the world.
It's just so drastically different.
Yes.
If you ever see me looking to the side, I do have my notes. And my screen went black, so I'm absolutely sorry.
Oh, it didn't go black this end, so yes.
Perfect.
Yeah. So actually, I can just keep talking while you look at your notes, because Claire she gets to London. I mean, this is the story. So she finally gets to London. She has a very difficult relationship with her stepmother, and she ends up going to London. And she gets a job as a shop girl. And, this was also at a time where very few women had ambitions other than fame or getting married. It was definitely the minority who went to college and had full careers in those days. But when she's in London, she just quite by chance falls in with a crowd of people who are, musicians and just quite glamorous people. And on a whim, they whisk her off to Marrakesh to stay with Paul and Talita Getty. And actually that was very much how it happened. People did. It was so easy to travel. And because it was the time when counterculture was taking hold, in America, over here it was Woodstock and Haight-Ashbury and the Summer of Love, but in Europe it was a very different. Whoops, there goes my iPad. It was a very different scene in Europe, and what people were doing in Europe was the North African hippie trail. So the counterculture was all heading to North Africa to go and travel and experiment with drugs, and anyone who was anyone would stop off at the Gettys en route. In fact, a couple of people that I spoke to said that what they were told was they had to go to Tangier before going to Marrakesh to kind of stock up on clothes and drugs. I didn't know this at the time of writing, but I did speak to them. There was a man in Tangier called Ahmed, who actually Marianne Faithfull and Anita Pallenberg found. This man was wandering through the streets of Tangier with a huge vase on his head, and they decided to follow him, and they ended up in his little shop in a little alleyway, and the shop had almost nothing in it, just sort of 3 or 4 exquisite sort of trinkets. And all of a sudden he sort of snapped his fingers, he sat them down, and boys came out with mint tea that they poured from a great height, and then hashish. And they said he had the best drugs of anywhere. And so actually, before staying with the Gettys, people would often go to Tangier first, and they would go to Ahmed, who the Rolling Stones and their friends nicknamed Hole in the Head, because, Cockney rhyming slang, I don't know whether you know, in England is like apples and pears is stairs, Barnet Fair is hair. So they called Ahmed Hole in the Head. So they'd go to Hole in the Heads to stock up on drugs before showing up at the Gettys for their parties and lavish picnics on their rooftop. And yeah.
This is just amazing that they're pre-gaming across North Africa.
I know.
And so when we were going through our authors for our winter series, which it no longer feels like winter here, and you're in Charleston, so we won. And as we were going through who's going to get to do what talks and what we're reading, when I saw that this was set in Morocco, I was like, this is the one I want. This is what we're doing.
And have you ever been?
No, I haven't, but my husband and I are making our travel list now that we can go places, and it is very high on the list.
Well, and now they have opened Marrakesh again. It was closed for a long time during COVID. In fact, my parents are going next week. And luckily you won't have to worry about the spell that Talita casts. But of course, what happens with Claire is, she does fall under Talita's spell, because everyone who knew Talita described her as an enchantress. She was truly, astonishingly beautiful, very vivacious and outgoing, and always laughing. And she created the party. Now, I also now believe that actually she needed to constantly be surrounded by people because of the trauma of her childhood. She was always running. And actually, it occurred to me on more than one occasion that so many people that we lost so early during the 60s and the 70s, Talita being one, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Mark Bolan. There are so many that died of drugs primarily. And I have to wonder, we now know today that trauma lasts for 6 generations. And we also have access to so many things that can alleviate that trauma, whether it's therapy, whether it's medication. And I can't help but wonder whether so many of those people who died so tragically and so young were almost self-medicating with alcohol and drugs. And Talita's case, there is no doubt in my mind, she did have depression, particularly towards the end, but she hid it so well when there were people around. And so she constantly surrounded herself with a whirlwind of people. And when Claire, my little country mouse, who is renamed Cece by the crowd because it's more glamorous and more fitting, she falls under Talita's spell, but she doesn't realize that there is a price to pay with that lifestyle, that nobody gets off scot-free, and she doesn't realize the danger that she has put herself in by allowing herself to be drawn in.
That's very true. And you give Claire the kindness that Talita can take for herself, for anyone in that world, really.
Yeah. And actually, in truth, you know, I think Talita and Paul were very mismatched. I think there was a deep, deep love for one another, for each other, but she was an extrovert and hiding her pain. He had his own difficult childhood, but he was truly an introvert. And he really, I think he was very drawn to Talita, who was very like his mother. His mother, Anne Rourke, was a famous San Francisco socialite, and the party was always at their house. And I think there was much of Talita that reminded him of that, but by nature, he was an introvert. And he just found it harder and harder to have all the people in the house. And he retreated to, first of all, opium addiction and then heroin addiction. But he did say to a lot of women who were in their lives, who were friends of hers, he would take them aside and say, look after her. She needs a stable influence. You know, you're good for her. Be a friend. And so I think on some level, you know, I wonder whether they sort of knew.
You mentioned while you were doing research that you discovered a bevy of other historical figures that deserve their own works. Do you think you'll be doing more historical fiction?
I have actually pretty much finished a sequel to Sister Stardust, although it's a novella, and at the moment there are no plans to bring it out in print. It's actually coming out as a serialized podcast in the fall.
That is so cool.
Yes, and it will be highly produced and acted in sound effects, and it will be, I think, a 6 to 8 part podcast that it's going to start recording as soon as I finish editing, which will be shortly, as soon as I'm back home next week. And yeah, that's really exciting, because it's just so interesting to me how many other mediums there are and other ways to express creativity.
That's fascinating too. I've never heard of anyone doing like the sequel as a podcast.
Yeah.
Your Instagram for the book is very cool. I know there's a Spotify playlist. I'm not sure if you or your publisher put that together, but also very cool. Listen to
I did.
Weekend.
I
wanted to give you the credit, but then I didn't see it on your website, so I wasn't unsure.
Actually, funnily enough, the HarperCollins in Australia did their own playlist, which was fantastic. They hadn't realized I'd done one, but I did one that was specifically Britain. It was the music in the UK from 1966 to 1971. So it spans the time of the book, and it was the music I grew up with. And actually, when I first put it up, I opened it so that other people could contribute, and somebody went on and added all of this amazing music that I love, like Creedence Clearwater Revival and Crosby, Stills, Nash, and all the music I love, but it wasn't right for this book, because this book is so European. So but yeah, Sister Stardust, the playlist is on Spotify, available to all, and you can't add your own music anymore, sorry.
Well, you have it covered. It's a very good playlist.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm so excited for this podcast now. And Raya is here, so I will throw it to her with everyone's Q&A questions.
Yeah, we have a few in the Q&A, so I'll get to those. But for everyone else who's been listening in rapt attention to hear about Marrakesh and Talita's life, now is your time to ask your question by typing it into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So go ahead and do that now, and I'll get started with what we've got so far. So let me start with the sort of, this is a major departure for you and the sort of books you've written in the past. And I think it's also interesting that, you're constrained a bit because you have real characters and you did all this research. And
now, is it just me? Is Raya
freeze for you?
She's
Raya, you have frozen. I will give you a minute to unfreeze. You're back.
She's unfrozen.
Sorry.
We're all doing our March 2020 Zoom experience tonight.
So we got to constrained.
You're constrained a bit because you have real history, real characters. And yet you also have your own story with your own characters, including Claire, who you need to weave through. So did you find it challenging to do the synthesis of the sort of historic, real part based on your research and the direction that you wanted to put in creatively? And how did you sort of manage that fusion?
Such a great question. I actually loved it. I think I loved the challenge of it. I also had so much research to fall back on. So a lot of the conversation, or the tone of the conversations with, like, Bill Willis, for example, who was their great friend and decorator, happened. I mean, I was able to lift. There's a scene with Yves Saint Laurent where he creates a sort of bird's nest out of twigs and branches and leaves in her hair, which actually happened. So there was so much of it that I was just able to sort of fictionalize. I took great care generally throughout the whole thing. I was very aware that there are people here today alive who knew her, who loved her. Her son is still around. Many people are still around. And I wanted to treat her with the utmost respect and love. I also wanted to be very careful with Mick Jagger, for example. You know, Mick Jagger makes a cameo appearance, but it's so anodyne that there's nothing in it that could possibly be offensive. So that really, I started off as a journalist, and I was always a bit of a rubbish journalist for exactly this reason. I never wanted to upset anyone. And I felt like that with this book. It ended up being my version of a love letter to the 60s, to Marrakesh, and to Talita Getty. And I have no idea whether the family know about it, but I do know one of her friends who I became quite friendly with. After a while, I knew I had to send her the book. And it was with, enormous trepidation. I sent her the book, and a few days went by. And then she phoned and she said, well, I've read the book and you got something wrong. And I thought, oh God, what is it? And she said, well, there's a scene in the book where when Cece arrives in Marrakesh, because it's been on such a whim, she arrives with nothing. And there's a knock on her bedroom door when she's at the palace, and a houseboy is standing there with a pile of clothes that Talita has sent down for her to wear. And my friend said, Talita was far too self-centered. She would never have let anybody else wear her clothes. But she then said, I've read many, many books about that time period, and all of them have sensationalized the sex and the drugs and everything that went on. She said, and I've never seen anybody do what you have done with this book, which is you've captured how it felt. And even saying that to you now, I get goosebumps, because there is no higher praise I could have wished for or hoped for. And in a weird sort of way, I mean, it was just so validating, because I felt like I was there when I was writing it. I really did. It was like almost this sort of dream state where I just wrote this book feeling as if I was there. So,
well, I'm gonna take a tangent with our next question, which comes from Katie. Hi, Katie, who wanted to know if you had conversations with anyone who had known Talita and Paul, so maybe descendants or relatives or people who had known them as you were working. And obviously you went to Marrakesh, so you sort of walked in their footsteps a little bit, but did you interview people, or was it just that you did research based on what you could find and then you imagined the rest?
So initially it was all research through reading. But actually, and I moved to London to write this. I was meant to be there for a year, but with COVID, I came back, and I'd set up all these meetings with people. And of course, as soon as I got there was lockdown, and everything was, you could only go out to exercise. I mean, everything was cancelled. But I ended up having some really wonderful conversations, and certainly meeting somebody who was around. I will say that I used their stories. And I said to each of them, I'm not going to use your stories for research. It was more to corroborate what I had, to help me to sort of validate that what I'd written, what I was writing was right. Yeah, it was really more for corroboration than to use anything that they gave me in the story. Yeah, there were no specifics that I put in, but it was very much kind of, this is how it was.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Sharon has a question about the food, and says that first of all, that the book is as amazing as Sharon thought it was going to be. So well done, Sharon. But wants to know how you decided which recipes to share because everything sounds so good.
Well, I didn't actually put in very much. So I did have, my recipe for Majun, the ancient Amazigh recipe, is in the book. Also, Talita was known to make the Alice B. Toklas chocolate fudge with cannabis. So that went in the book. By the way, my publishers totally wanted to take both those recipes out. And every time I'd get the manuscript back and those recipes would be out, I'd put them back in. I know it's a little odd, but I think that's okay. I like books that are a little odd. Actually, the first book I ever read that had food in it was Laura Esquivel, Like Water for Chocolate. And I remember being so charmed by these unexpected recipes. But then the other recipe that went in was Bill Willis. He was the one who enticed the Gettys to Marrakesh on their honeymoon. He found this dilapidated palace that they bought. He was then in charge of renovating it, and he was a gifted decorator. You know, he was a Southern boy from Kentucky who adored Morocco. He adored Marrakesh, you know, everything Moroccan, and lived there for the rest of his life. But he insisted on teaching his cook, Habibi, his mother's Southern recipes. And so, you know, Southern cheese souffle was something that he served. Now, that is not his recipe, but that is a recipe that I found and loved. And so I had to put it in as my tribute to Bill Willis.
I love that. Okay, let's see. You spoke about the serialized podcast, but are there any plans to make Sister Stardust into a film, into a movie version?
I think that it would make a fantastic, you know, limited series TV. I just think it would be. In fact, the shows that have been made about the Gettys in the last couple of years, one of them was Trust. I think the other one was All the Money in the World, and they have tiny little scenes in Marrakesh with Paul and Talita, which give you like a little taste. But I think there's so much here, from Talita's time in the camps as a child to her growing up and being this free spirit in London. It feels, I mean, I'm starting to get inquiries. It feels like a slower burn than I'm used to. And I wonder whether, look, the whole world has changed since I last had a book out 3 years ago. And I don't know how many books were released last Tuesday, but it was more than I have ever seen. It was just an insane number of books. And it's incredibly hard to get noticed today. So I feel like this is slowly building. So we shall see. We shall see. Look, I'm very fatalistic. I'm ready. Should people be interested? But I also would rather they stumbled upon it themselves than I have an agent send it out to people. I think that with any luck, it will fall into the hands of somebody that's the thing. This is a passion play for me. This is my favorite of all of my 21 novels. If I died tomorrow, I would die happy knowing I've written a book that I am so enormously proud of. And if an actress or a producer or, if somebody were to read it who felt that same passion, then that would be wonderful.
we have just a few more minutes, so I want to ask one of Sharon's questions. Sharon, thanks for this one, about where the title comes from and whether the title was your idea, maybe your editor's idea. Sister Stardust, I was thinking, well, definitely they had a son with a very interesting moniker. I believe he had the words gramophone and galaxy in his name.
So, yes. Their son, Tara, who was born in 1968, his full name is Tara Gabriel Gramophone Galaxy Getty. It was the 60s. Sister Stardust, actually, my working title for it was always the Pleasure Palace. So, you know, off of Talita's Le Palais des Plaisirs. So in my head, it was always going to be the Pleasure Palace, which I loved. But then when it went to the sales team at HarperCollins, they came back saying it sounded like an erotica novel. So, of course, that was very quickly nixed. And my brilliant editor, John Glynn, came up with the title himself. So he came up with Sister Stardust. I will also say the art department there did the most beautiful job with the cover. And actually, they talked me through the process, and everybody on the team read this book, and you would be amazed at how rarely that happens and how many times I've just had the quintessential summer beachy woman from behind gazing into, you know, the ocean, that generic cover when it has nothing to do with the story. And they took enormous care with this book, and I think packaged it beautifully.
It is a really striking cover, and I think it does harken back to that photograph that you mentioned on that rooftop, that Litchfield photograph in a way. It just has that vibe to it.
Yes, it is. It has a magic, and the book really is, you know, once you get to Marrakesh, it is a magic carpet ride into a world of Arabian Nights.
One of the questions that we often like to ask authors is, who are you reading? What are you loving? Do you have something where you're like, you know what I'm really into right now, and it's this other author? So do you have anything like that where you're like, you know, the thing that I'm reading now, or, you know, one of my favorites that I can always go to?
Oh, always. And there's nothing that I love more than supporting other authors. Are you ready? Because I may give you a few. Okay. So I just finished an actually blurb because I really loved it, Mystique Island by Sarah McCoy, which is another sort of historical fiction set on the island of Mystique, where coincidentally Mick Jagger has had a home for years and years, and that takes place in the 70s, and I thought that was charming. I also have loved John Searle's Her Last Affair. If you like psychological thrillers, that is very dark and very clever. I am reading the new book by Amy Popel, The Sweet Spot. Her book Musical Chairs was one of my absolute favorites, I think perhaps of all time, actually. What else am I reading? I know Jamie Brenner has a new book coming out, which I'm really looking forward to. I don't have it yet. And also Jean Hamp Korelitz, who has been one of my dearest friends and one of my most favorite writers. And she was one of my most favorite writers before she became one of my dearest friends, which is kind of the beauty of being in this, you know, you get to be friends with people who you revere. She wrote The Plot last year, which was wonderful. She also wrote the book You Should Have Known, which became the TV show The Undoing, with Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant, which was, you know, I think everybody's sort of binge watch favorite during COVID. She has a new book called The Latecomer, and that is next on my list.
Those are some really great suggestions. I know it went by kind of fast, and everyone's going to ask me in the chat. I tried to take some notes. So Mystique Island
by Sarah McCoy.
McCoy. Her Last Affair, which is the Searles book.
Yeah.
The Sweet Spot by Popel. And we didn't have a title for the new Brenner book yet.
But I think, is it let me look and see if I can find out. But Jamie Brenner's new book, I think it is it. I get them confused. It might be Guilt.
Guilt?
I have a
Guilt?
feeling her new one might be Guilt, but I think she's a great writer, so I'm looking forward to that.
We'll go with Guilt, but check out whatever Jamie Brenner's
yes.
writing, and then
And
The
then-
Latecomer by Corlitz.
Yes.
Wonderful call outs, great suggestions.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone, for asking such amazing questions. I know we could probably have asked many more, and I'm so sorry if we didn't get to ask your question tonight live. I will be putting the link for the bookshop shop that you can purchase the book if you haven't yet. And not only does that help support Book and Author Society, help support your local independent bookstore, but also if you put your bookshop ID into your survey after this event, we'll make sure that you get a signed book plate from Jane. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. And I'm going to pop back out and let you and Sarah finish up.
Thank you so much, Raya. Sarah, thank you for this amazing opportunity. I've loved talking to you. I'm always sad on these things that I can't see all the people. There's something so lovely about seeing faces, but maybe we'll get to that technology at some point.
We'll get back. I'm going to an actual tour event this week, and really everyone watch your newsletters, watch the Instagram, the Twitter, the Facebook. We have an announcement about our upcoming first post-COVID live event very, very soon. We're finalizing details. And I know because you're all asking me, you're asking our fellow board members, you're asking the people you know that know board members, and then you're writing it in the surveys. So we know you really want to be in the same room with the authors and not just on the other side of the Zoom. Jane, is there anything else you want to say before I give a little wrap-up spiel?
Actually, yes. The one thing I just want to end with is that bizarrely writing this book and falling so in love with this book has sort of reawakened my old art school self. And so I ended up designing all these caftans and necklaces based, all inspired by Talita. So if you go to my Instagram, Jane Green Author, you can have a look through and see what I've put in my shop for inspired by Talita.
I love how much you love her and how clearly this was the book you were meant to write. I think someone in the Q&A said that as well. It's so nice to find authors finding those passion projects that they were clearly like, this is why you are here to do this.
Yeah. Thank you. And on that note, I've had a gorgeous time. And I'm now going to go out and get a drink with an old friend of mine in Charleston.
All right, you go do that, and I will do the finishing up real fast.
Okay, mwah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jane. Everyone that's still with me, our next event is May 23rd, and listen closely, it's at noon, but there's a good reason. We are doing a panel event of women's writers that are all of your summer must-reads. We have Brenda Nowak, Lori Foster, Rand Thane, and Sarah Morgan, who is joining us from the UK, which is why we are talking at noon. Register for that. Registration links are up at brokenauthor.com, and then check all of our socials in the newsletter. I am the broken record about this because, hey, where are you going to get our information if not from those places? So follow all of that for registration information. Go to our website. And if you cannot make the noon time, still register. You'll get sent a YouTube link after the event, so you can still take a second, watch it, see all of your favorite authors. Like I said, stay up to date on everything because we will be making a nice announcement very, very shortly. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you again, Jane, who has gone off for her drink in Charleston, which sounds absolutely lovely. We are so grateful to have all of you here, and we are very, very excited for our May event. So any questions or anything, you know where to find us.